The coach wheels slowed as the dusty trail opened to the valley she once called home. The wealthy widow had left this land years ago, swearing she would never return, yet something inside her pulled her back across those harsh miles. As she stepped down with her leather suitcase in hand, the dry wind brushed against her face with a familiar sting, carrying the scent of sagebrush. Old timber and memories she had tried to bury. Her deep-colored dress fluttered lightly as she took her first step toward the abandoned ranch she inherited. A place that had once been full of promise before grief hollowed it out. She expected silence and broken fences. She expected emptiness. She expected the kind of stillness that comes from land forgotten. What she did not expect was movement. At first she thought her tired eyes were playing tricks. But as the sun shifted behind the ridge, she saw a tall figure standing near the porch that had once belonged to her family. A towering Apache stood there, broad-shouldered and steady, his shadows stretching long across the dusty ground. His presence alone was startling, but it was what surrounded him that nearly made her lose her breath. 5 children stood close to him, each carrying a mix of curiosity and caution in their wide eyes. Dust clung to their clothes, and their small hands gripped each other as if the earth beneath them could shift without warning. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. This ranch had been abandoned for years. No one should have been living here, especially not an Apache man with 5 young souls depending on him. She froze in place, suitcase tight in her grip, her pulse quickening as she tried to understand how her empty land had become the home of strangers. The wind carried the quiet sound of the children whispering among themselves, but the man said nothing. He stood as still as the mountains, watching her every movement with unwavering strength and guarded calm. Her boots scraped the dirt as she stepped forward, each movement echoing louder in her chest. The old ranch looked different now. Someone had patched the broken roof. Someone had stacked firewood neatly against the wall. Someone had kept the place alive while she was miles away, searching for peace that never fully arrived. She felt a strange mix of anger and wonder rising in her chest. This land was hers, yet she felt like a visitor walking into another world. The Apache finally shifted his stance, holding the smallest child gently against his chest, and she could not understand whether his eyes held warning or welcome. Questions rushed through her mind, faster than her lips could shape them. Why was he here? How long had he been living on her ranch? Were these children his own, or orphans he had taken under his protection? And why, out of all the deserted land in this wild territory, had he chosen her home to settle on? The old stories she had heard in towns about brave warriors, wandering families, and hidden struggles flickered in her memory, but nothing could explain the sight in front of her. She had expected the ranch to greet her with silence. Instead, it greeted her with a mystery as she approached. The children stepped closer to the Apache, their small feet shifting nervously in the dust. She noticed the strength in the man's posture, the steady heartbeat of a protector, and the way he placed one hand lightly on the oldest boy's shoulder, as if signaling him to stay calm. Despite the tension in the air, there was something gentle in that gesture, something that hinted at a story she had yet to learn. The widow had lived long enough to understand that people did not simply appear on abandoned ranches without carrying burdens of their own. Her heart thudded slowly as she looked at them. The children's faces held stories that words hadn't yet touched. The smallest had a wool blanket wrapped around him. The tallest had a determined look, standing in front of his siblings like a small guardian. One child clung to the Apache's leg with silent trust. Another held a carved wooden figure, worn from being held too tightly for too long. Their presence stirred something deep inside her that she had tried to keep buried since losing her own family. The Apache finally spoke, his voice deep and calm, carrying the weight of many miles. He didn't step back, but he didn't approach either. His tone held no hostility, yet there was no apology in it. The land had shaped him just as it had shaped her, and she sensed he was a man who chose his words with care. Even with that one sentence, she felt the earth shift beneath her feet. It wasn't the words alone, but the quiet strength behind them, the unspoken truth that he had been here long enough to feel this land as his own. She felt a storm rising inside her, made of confusion, frustration, and something she couldn't yet name. She looked past him at the ranch she used to walk through every morning, imagining her life before it crumbled. She had come back with plans to rebuild, to reclaim what was hers, to plant new roots in old soil. But now the land was breathing with new life, with 5 children and a warrior who clearly didn't intend to run. The wind pressed against her dress, as if urging her to take another step, to confront the truth waiting here. A part of her wanted to demand answers. Another part hesitated. Standing before a powerful man who carried 5 little ones under his protection, she realized this place was no longer a simple ranch. It was a shelter for someone who needed it, perhaps even someone the world had pushed too hard. She had known struggle, but she had never known theirs. The land between them felt wide and tight at the same time, full of tension that neither of them could step around. The children watched her with wide eyes, unsure if she was a threat or a hope. She felt the weight of their gaze like a question placed directly into her hands. She didn't know if she should speak or wait. She didn't know if she should claim the ranch or step back. The Apache's unreadable expression made it impossible to guess what he expected from her. For the first time since she stepped off the coach, she felt the ranch breathing again. Alive with a story she had never imagined, she tightened her grip on the suitcase, the dry wind tugging softly at her hat. The sun dipped lower, painting long shadows that stretched between her and the family standing before her. This was her land, yet something told her the real battle was not about property. It was about fate, about choices, about the unknown path unfolding in front of her as the air thickened with silence. She took one final breath, ready to speak. But before she could form the words, the smallest child lifted a hand toward her, as if recognizing something in her presence that even she did not understand, and that simple gesture changed everything. The truth behind their presence was waiting to come out. But she sensed that whatever story the Apache carried was far heavier than anything she had expected to face on her return. The land had brought her home for a reason, but she had no idea how deeply that reason would pull her into the lives of the strangers now standing on her. Porched at the next moment would decide everything. The small hand reaching toward her made the widow freeze in place. It was such a gentle gesture, so innocent that it eased the tightness in her chest for just a heartbeat. The little one blinked up at her with eyes that held both fear and trust, as if he wasn't sure which one he should choose yet. She opened her fingers slightly, almost without thinking, but the Apache shifted his stance the moment he noticed. Not roughly, not sharply, just with a quiet protective instinct that made it clear he had stood between these children and danger many times before. She let her hand fall back to her side, not wanting to stir any fear within them. The wind rolled over the land, lifting strands of her dark hair under her hat as she studied the man carefully. He had the stability of stone, but stones also carried stories carved by storms. She felt those storms sitting behind his eyes. She sensed that whatever had brought him here was something he had carried for a long time, something he didn't intend to share with a stranger. But this land belonged to her. She had not come all this way to turn back at the first sign of mystery. She drew in a slow breath, trying to gather her words. The ranch held too many memories for her voice to come easily. Her late husband used to stand exactly where the Apache stood now. She could still see him in her mind, tall and confident, building this ranch with dreams as wide as the sky. She had left after losing him, unable to walk through the empty rooms without feeling the weight of grief pressing down on her shoulders. She had promised herself she would never return, yet here she stood, face to face with a man who had claimed the abandoned land as if it had always been his. The Apache lowered his gaze toward the child leaning against his leg. His voice, when it came again, was steady, but carried something heavy beneath it. She watched the children cling to him, each one relying on his presence as if he was their only anchor. Their quiet behind him spoke louder than any words. These weren't children passing by. They were living here, eating here, sleeping under her patched roof. Something within that truth unsettled her more deeply than she expected. She finally forced herself to speak. Her tone came out calm, even though her heartbeat wasn't. The Apache listened in silence, but he did not shift an inch. When she asked how long he had been staying on her ranch, the oldest boy lifted his chin with a mixture of shyness and bravery. But the Apache placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, keeping him still. It was clear the man chose what was spoken and what remained hidden. She waited for an answer, but he offered none. The silence stretched across the yard like a rope pulled tight. It wasn't the silence of disrespect. It was the silence of a man deciding how much of his world he would allow a stranger to step into. The widow understood more than she wished she did. She had kept her own heart locked behind quiet walls since the day loss broke her. She knew the sound of someone choosing silence over vulnerability. She looked across the ranch with growing unease. The ground she once rode across had changed. It wasn't the same land she left behind. The barn door had been repaired with new planks. The water trough near the fence was clean and full. Someone had swept the porch recently. The place wasn't abandoned anymore. Someone had turned it back into a home. Another breeze drifted between them. It carried the faint sound of a wooden wind chime she didn't recognize. She frowned. That wind chime wasn't hers. It hung where her husband once hung a lantern. That small detail cut deeper than she expected. It was like seeing someone else's handwriting inside a letter she never sent. Her voice softened when she spoke again. She wasn't accusing anymore. She was trying to understand. The Apache watched her for a long moment before shifting slightly. Enough to draw the children's attention, but not enough to close the distance between them. He finally answered her question, but only with a short explanation that left more mystery than clarity. He spoke of the land offering shelter. He spoke of danger that had chased them for miles. He didn't explain what kind of danger, or who had been after them. The widow felt her shoulders tense as she realized she might be standing in the middle of something far larger than she expected. The oldest girl stepped forward, her small fingers clutching the edge of the Apache's belt for courage. She looked at the widow with eyes full of questions. The girl seemed to want to speak, to explain, but fear held her voice back. The widow's heart softened at the sight of her. She had worked with children before, in the earliest years of her marriage, when she dreamed of having little ones of her own. She recognized the hunger in that girl's gaze, the longing for safety, for someone to listen. She sank slightly to her knees so she wouldn't tower over the children. Her dress brushed the dust. She greeted the girl gently, but before the child could answer, the Apache placed a hand on her shoulder. The widow looked up and saw the warning in his expression. Not anger, not hostility, but a firm boundary. He was protecting them from something she had not yet earned the right to hear. She straightened again, brushing the dust from her skirt. Her frustration began to mix with curiosity. She couldn't simply walk away, but she also couldn't force the truth out of someone carrying this level of heaviness. The ranch behind her creaked softly as the wind shifted direction, as if reminding her that she needed to choose. Her next step carefully. Her thoughts drifted back to the journey that brought her here. She had spent months gathering the strength to return. She had told herself she came back for closure, to rebuild her life, to reclaim what grief had once taken. But now, she wondered if her return had another purpose. The land had always taught her that nothing happened without reason. Maybe she wasn't meant to come home to an empty ranch after all. Maybe she was meant to walk into this moment, to face this unexpected chapter. The Apache looked at her suitcase, then back at her. Something unspoken passed between them. She felt it like a quiet pull in the air. He understood she had come to stay, and she understood he had nowhere else to take the children. That truth pressed down on both of them, yet neither dared to say it out loud. She took a cautious step toward the porch. The children pressed themselves closer to the Apache. Their eyes tracked her, unsure whether she would push them away or offer something better. She paused again, her voice gentle but steady. She explained that the ranch belonged to her, but she did not speak with the harsh authority of someone demanding a stranger to leave. Instead, she spoke as someone trying to navigate a fragile moment. The Apache nodded once, slowly, but gave no sign that he intended to move the children from the place they had made their refuge. The widow studied his face carefully. He wasn't defying her. He was protecting them. She felt that truth settle inside her like a slow-burning ember. She had many questions. Who were these children? Why were they alone with him? What danger had pushed them across the wild land? But she knew better than to demand answers from a man who had clearly been fighting for their survival as she stood there. The oldest boy stepped forward for the first time. He held a thin leather strap in his hand, something tied around a carved piece of wood. He looked at her hesitantly, then at the Apache. The man gave him a small nod, encouraging him. The boy extended the carved piece toward the widow. Her fingers brushed the rough surface as she took it. It was a simple carving, shaped like a bird in flight. She looked back at the boy. His eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear anymore. It was hope. She didn't yet understand the meaning behind the carving, but she felt a shift in the air, a quiet invitation into a story she hadn't expected to be part of. The Apache watched her reaction closely, measuring her response to the boy's offering. The widow held the carving gently and realized that the mystery surrounding this family was only beginning to unfold. The land felt different now, alive with more questions than answers. She sensed that whatever truths were hidden in their silence would change everything she believed about her past and her future. But before she could say another word, a sound broke across the valley, sharp and distant. The Apache's entire posture changed. The children tensed, as if they recognized the meaning behind that echo. The widow felt a chill crawl up her spine. Whatever danger he had mentioned earlier was closer than she thought, and the ranch was no longer just her return to the past. It had become the center of something far more uncertain. The sharp sound rolled across the valley again, carried by the wind like a warning that had traveled too far to be ignored. The widow felt it settle deep in her chest, tightening everything inside her. The Apache shifted his stance. In that instant, she saw the silent alertness of a man who had spent years listening for danger before anyone else sensed it. The children moved closer together, clinging to each other, their small bodies trembling just enough for her to notice. Whatever had chased them had left its mark on their fear. The widow turned her gaze toward the distant ridge, searching the horizon for anything that moved. The land stretched wide and open, a huge sweep of red earth and brush that usually felt honest and predictable. But now it seemed too exposed, too quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. She felt the sun heavy on her back, but a faint shiver moved across her arms. The Apache said nothing, yet his presence shifted around the children like a shield. His dark hair, braided with worn leather, moved slightly as he scanned the land. In that moment, she realized something with absolute clarity. If danger was coming, he had no intention of running. Not again. Not with these 5 young souls depending on him. She tried to steady her breath as she stepped slightly closer, needing answers she wasn't sure he would give. He flicked his gaze toward her but did not soften. That distant sound, whatever it was, had drawn an invisible line through the moment they were sharing. She asked him quietly what it meant. The Apache hesitated. His answer came slow, like a truth he didn't want to lay bare. He said there were men who had followed them across the plains. Men who believed these children belonged to no one. Men who wanted to claim them for reasons that chilled her blood even before she fully understood. His words were limited, but the weight behind them was enough to set her heart racing. The widow felt a rush of protectiveness she had not expected. She had known hardship, but she had lived most of her life under the safety of her husband's name and wealth. She had never faced the kind of threat that made a grown man walk miles with 5 children, holding on to hope with bare hands. The conflict unfolding around her felt larger than her own grief, larger than anything she had imagined when she stepped off the coach with her suitcase. She looked at the children again. The oldest boy held himself stiffly, watching the ridge as if he expected something to rise from it. The girl who had stepped forward earlier held the wooden carving tightly, her small knuckles whitening around it. The smallest child clung to the Apache's side, burying his face against him to hide from the tension stretching across the yard. The widow's thoughts churned. If dangerous men were searching for this family, her ranch was no longer a simple resting place. It was a crossroads between everything she had run from and everything she feared she was walking into. She hadn't planned for this, but the land had never cared for plans. It offered what it offered, and people survived by adjusting to what came. She turned toward the house, trying to gather her thoughts. The memory of her late husband rose in her mind. He had been a man of strong belief, a man who helped anyone who crossed his path with genuine need. He once told her that land always tested its keepers. It revealed the truth of their character when the quiet days gave way to hard choices. She wondered what he would do if he were standing here, facing a warrior and 5 frightened children who needed shelter. As she lingered on the edge of her porch, she felt drawn back to the moment she left this ranch years ago. She had walked away carrying sorrow she believed would swallow her if she stayed. The grief had nearly broken her, yet something deeper kept her alive through the lonely months. She had returned now, out of determination to rebuild. But she didn't expect the land to test her this quickly, or this sharply. A heavy silence settled between her and the Apache. She could feel the tension, like a thread stretched across the space between them. They were strangers tied together suddenly by circumstances neither of them controlled. She sensed he was waiting to see how she would react, whether she would push them away or stand with them. The children seemed to hold the same question in their fragile stares. The widow stepped off the porch, her boots pressing into the warm dust. She asked him if the men chasing them knew this land. He shook his head once, but there was no relief in that gesture. Men desperate enough to track a warrior across miles would not stop simply because the land grew rough. They would search until they found a trail, and she feared that trail had led straight to a ranch. In another moment, the oldest girl tugged gently on the Apache's arm. She whispered something in a soft voice, and he placed a hand on her back, grounding her. The widow felt a pang inside her chest. The children had such quiet courage. They carried a strength built from hardship rather than choice. She saw that truth in the way the oldest boy stood a little ahead of the others, as if ready to protect them even though his own shoulders were small and narrow. The widow asked the Apache how long they had been running. He answered with a single word that made her breath stumble. Weeks. That meant nights without proper sleep, searching for shelter wherever they could find it, always listening for danger creeping behind them. She wondered how many close calls they had faced, how many sunrises they greeted not with hope but with fear of being found. She wanted to know why the children were hunted.
Oh.
He looked away from her, toward the ridge again, his jaw tightening. Whatever truth sat behind this moment was a truth he carried with careful hands. He wasn't avoiding her. He was protecting them. Every pause, every unsaid word was a shield he placed between the children and the world. The widow felt the pull of 2 different paths inside her. She could insist he'd tell her everything. It was her land, her home. She had every right to demand answers, but the look in the children's eyes held her back. They had lived through things that might crush a grown heart. Forcing the truth from the man who kept them alive felt wrong, even if fear told her she needed to know. She stepped closer to the smallest child, who peeked at her from behind the Apache's leg. She spoke softly, asking if he was hungry. The faintest nod came from him before he hid his face again. She felt something warm unfold in her chest. These children weren't intruders. They were survivors. Hungry, tired, and holding on to the one protector they trusted. She told them they could come inside to rest. The Apache didn't move at first. His eyes met hers, sharp and searching. He needed to know her intention. She didn't look away. She told him calmly that she didn't plan to let anyone harm them while they were under her roof. She didn't know if she could fully protect them, but she knew she wouldn't stand aside. The moment stretched long. The Apache finally nodded, slow and cautious. The children exhaled quietly. But before they stepped forward, he looked at her and asked the question she had been avoiding since she arrived. His voice was low. He wanted to know if she still intended to reclaim the ranch for herself. The widow felt the words press against her heart. She looked at the porch, the patched roof, the wind chime that wasn't hers. For the first time since coming home, she realized this land no longer held only her past. It held someone else's survival. She said she didn't know her answer yet. The Apache accepted her honesty with a silent nod. The smallest child took a timid step forward, and the widow reached out her hand. It's not touching, just showing him he was welcome. The tension eased by a fraction, but beneath it all, the distant danger still hovered, waiting to come closer. The main conflict had only begun to surface. The truth behind this family's journey remained hidden. The threat on the ridge was creeping nearer, and the widow knew the moment that truth arrived. It would change everything for her, the warrior, and the 5 innocent souls caught in the center of it. The widow stepped aside to let the children walk into the house first. But the Apache paused at the doorway. His tall frame filled the entrance, his presence steady like the beams holding up the porch. The moment he crossed inside, a deep shift settled through the air. As if the past and present were meeting one another for the first time, the widow felt her breath tighten. The ranch she had abandoned was no longer hers alone. Every step the children took, every quiet sound they made inside the space she once lived in, filled the home with new stories that layered over her old memories. She closed the door behind them and felt the weight of the world settle into the small, warm space. The children moved carefully, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. The oldest boy examined the table, the shelves, the faded curtains still hanging near the windows. The girl touched the wooden frame of the hearth with delicate fingers, as though the house whispered something to her. The smallest child climbed onto a wooden stool, his legs dangling, eyes sweeping across everything with cautious wonder. The widow glanced at the Apache. He looked around the room, not with fear, but with a guarded calm. He had the air of someone who studied every corner of a place before deciding if it could be trusted. She understood that instinct more than she wished she did. Losing her husband had taught her to read rooms with new eyes, searching for comfort in familiar walls and silence. Now she watched a man who had lived on the run, carrying 5 young lives across wild land, and she sensed an invisible storm, moving closer every moment. She moved toward the pantry and pulled out whatever she could find: dried bread, a few apples, and the remains of flour she had bought earlier from town. It wasn't much, but when she placed the food on the table, the children gathered around it with quiet gratitude. None of them lunged forward or fought for their share. They waited, glancing at the Apache to see if they were allowed. He gave a slight nod, and they began to eat slowly, each bite taken as if they were afraid the meal would end too soon. Watching them stirred an ache in her chest. These children were used to hunger. They were used to taking careful pieces, saving enough in case the next meal never came. That quiet discipline broke her heart in ways she hadn't expected. She turned away, blinking hard, pretending to busy herself at the counter. But even as the children ate, the tension in the air remained thick. They kept glancing toward the windows, toward the door, toward the Apache, as if listening for something she couldn't hear. The truth was still hidden, wrapped behind the man's guarded silence. She sensed the threat pressing closer. When the meal ended, the widow carried a bucket outside to pump water. She needed a moment alone to breathe. As the handle creaked beneath her grip, she looked toward the ridge again. The sun was sinking, tinting the valley with a copper glow. Shadows stretched long across the ground, merging with the thick brush, making the land feel more dangerous than before. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone out there was watching, waiting. Her heart hammered when she spotted fresh tracks near the fence line. They weren't made by her wagon or the Apache. They were too recent, too sharp. She crouched down, running her fingers over the edges of the prints. They belonged to horses. Several of them. She swallowed hard and rose slowly, keeping her eyes fixed on the ridge. Nothing moved, but the air carried the heavy silence of something closing in. When she returned inside, the Apache's gaze met hers instantly. He saw the change in her face and straightened. She didn't need to speak for him to know something was wrong. He moved toward the window and looked out, his jaw tightening. The children sensed the shift and huddled together. The widow could feel the storm tightening around them, drawing them all into its center. She told him what she found. His expression darkened with a seriousness she hadn't seen before. He explained that the men hunting them were skilled riders who didn't abandon a trail once they found it. If they had come near the ranch today, it meant they were searching the valley more carefully than before. The widow felt her breath slip. Her ranch wasn't a safe place anymore. It was a beacon. The Apache stepped outside without another word, scanning the land with sharp eyes. The widow followed, her pulse racing. She watched him walk along the fence, studying the tracks, touching the wooden posts as if feeling for signs she couldn't see. The wind pushed against them, warm and dry, carrying the faint smell of something burned far off in the distance. She wondered if the riders had set fires to smoke out trails. The Apache returned to her with a look that made her stomach twist. The men were closer than he hoped. He told her they might come at night, when shadows hid their approach. His voice held a quiet urgency, a warning sharpened by experience. The widow felt a cold shiver run through her bones. Nightfall wasn't far. They didn't have time. They went inside to prepare. The children gathered near the hearth, whispering softly. The widow moved through the house, checking windows, closing shutters, placing lanterns where they could be easily reached. She found her late husband's old rifle leaning against the storage cabinet. Dust clung to the barrel. Her hands trembled as she lifted it. She had never used it before. She didn't even know if it still fired. But the sight of it in her grip felt strangely grounding. The Apache watched her with careful eyes when she brought it out. He didn't question her. He simply examined the rifle, cleaned the dust with a piece of cloth, and handed it back to her with a slow nod. The widow felt her heartbeat echo in her ears. She wasn't a fighter. But she wasn't a woman who ran from danger anymore either. As the last of the daylight faded, the atmosphere grew thick with dread. The house felt too small to hold the fear pressing into it. The Apache positioned himself near the door, where he could see both the outside and the children. The widow stood near the window, clutching the rifle, though she wasn't sure when she might need it. Her pulse raced, but she kept her breathing steady for the children's sake. The valley grew darker, the sky shifting to deep blue. The wind turned colder. A distant coyote cried out, sending a chilling echo across the land. The children jumped, and the widow's hands tightened around the rifle. The Apache lifted his hand, signaling everyone to remain silent. Then they heard it. A faint crack of twigs far beyond the yard. A second sound followed, the quiet rumble of horses moving through brush. She felt the air tighten with fear. The Apache stepped forward, his body angled like a shield between the danger and the children. His voice dropped low, telling them to stay behind him. The widow pressed closer to the window. Her breath fogged the glass as she saw shadows moving near the far end of the ranch. Shapes too large to be deer, too silent to be harmless. She felt her chest grow tight. Whoever those men were, they were approaching with purpose. The Apache reached for the knife strapped to his waist. His stance shifted into something fierce, the kind of strength that came from protecting what mattered most. The widow felt a sudden surge of admiration and fear. This was not a man who bowed to danger. This was someone who stood and fought when everything told him to run. The horses stopped somewhere near the barn. Darkness swallowed their outlines, but she could hear them breathing, hear the low mutter of men speaking to one another. The widow's heart raced so fast, she thought it might break through her ribs. She glanced at the children, huddled together with wide eyes, their small bodies shaking. The Apache's gaze swept the room, then landed on her. It held a silent question. Was she ready? She didn't know if she was, but she nodded. The tension rose like a wave about to crash. The widow felt the house pulsing with fear and determination. Outside, the men moved slowly, circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Apache stepped closer to the door, ready to meet whatever came. While she braced herself near the window with the rifle held tight, the ranch had never been this silent. The valley had never felt this dangerous. The next moment would decide everything, and the climax was rising. With every heartbeat, the ranch held its breath as the men moved through the darkness. The widow could feel the tension pulled tighter, like a rope drawn to its breaking point. The Apache stood near the door, his silhouette tall and steady, while she pressed the rifle to her shoulder, trying not to let her hand shake. The children clung to each other behind the table, their eyes wide with fear and trust. Every second felt stretched beyond its size, waiting for something to break the silence. Then a single lantern outside flared, its light swinging in the wind. A rough voice called out, demanding the Apache step forward. The widow felt her heart clench, but the Apache didn't move. He remained rooted, his voice low as he told the men they had no right to the children. The reply came sharp, filled with anger about a bounty placed on the little ones, cruel hunt that had driven them across the wildland. The widow felt heat rise inside her as she listened. These children weren't criminals. They were orphans the Apache had rescued from a caravan raid months ago, shielding them when no one else did. The men outside wanted them only for reward money, not to offer safety or care. The Apache finally opened the door, stepping into the night with calm strength. The lantern light hit his face, revealing a resolve that made the widow's breath catch. She moved to stand behind him, her voice steady as she told the men the ranch was private land. She declared the children under her protection until proper authorities in town could judge the truth. The men scoffed, but the Apache's steady presence beside her shifted the balance of the moment. He told the men he would not surrender the children to anyone who meant them harm. One rider barked a threat and moved forward. But before the widow could lift her rifle, the oldest boy stepped to the doorway. His small hands trembled, but he held the carved wooden bird in front of him like a symbol of hope. The men hesitated, seeing the fear and bravery in his eyes. Something in that moment softened, as if the truth these children carried could no longer be ignored. The widow found her voice again, and told the riders that if they truly believed in justice, they should come to town in daylight and present their claims before the marshal. Riding into a widow's yard at night to take children by force was no lawful act. Her words struck deeper than she expected, and after a long, tense pause, the men muttered among themselves. Slowly, one by one, their horses backed away. The lantern dimmed as they retreated, their silhouettes shrinking into the dark valley. When the last hoofbeat faded, the widow let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. Her knees weakened, and she leaned against the doorframe. The Apache gently steadied her with one hand, his touch respectful, his presence grounding. The children rushed forward, wrapping their arms around him in relief, their small voices trembling as they whispered his name. He pulled them close, the weight of days spent running, finally easing from his shoulders. The widow watched him as he knelt to comfort the youngest child. Something inside her shifted, a soft warmth rising from a place she had shut away for too many seasons. This man had carried 5 children through danger with nothing but his strength and his determination. She saw honor in him, and she saw the courage it took for him to trust her tonight. It humbled her deeply. Morning came with a soft amber glow over the valley. The night's fear lifted with the sun as the ranch slowly woke to peace. The widow brewed warm tea, and the Apache helped the children wash their faces and hair. The house felt different now, not heavy with the ghosts of her past, but full of new life. Laughter returned, soft and timid, but real. The smallest child chased a beam of sunlight across the floor, while the girl braided the hair of her younger brother. For the first time since the widow arrived, the ranch felt like a home again. Later that morning, the widow insisted they all travel into town together. The Apache was hesitant, fearing the riders might twist the truth, but she reminded him that hiding forever would only bring more danger. She promised to stand with him, and the children nodded with brave hearts. They walked the long, dusty road together, creating a scene that turned heads as they entered the main street. The townspeople murmured, but the marshal stepped forward with a calm face. Asking for the entire story, the Apache spoke slowly, telling the truth of the raid, how he found the children alone, how he carried them because no one else would. The widow added her voice, sharing what she witnessed the night before, insisting the riders acted unlawfully and had no right to claim children who were never theirs. The marshal listened carefully, studying the faces of the little ones. It didn't take long for him to decide. He ruled the children safer under the widow's guardianship until proper documents could be sorted. The riders, realizing they had no legal ground, backed down in frustration and eventually turned away, leaving town with cold stares but no power to harm the family again. When the decision was made, the children clung to the widow and the Apache. Relief washed over all of them, like cool water on a burning day. The widow felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it was one of gratitude, not sorrow. They returned to the ranch with lighter steps, the road no longer feeling threatening but welcoming. Over the next weeks, life took on a gentle rhythm. The widow repaired the barn with the Apache's help. The children learned chores, feeding chickens, watering plants, and helping patch fences. The girl helped the widow cook, carefully stirring soups and learning to knead dough. The oldest boy spent hours carving small animals from leftover wood, leaving them on the porch rail as gifts. The widow kept every one of them. Slowly, the ranch transformed into something it had not been in years. A place of laughter again. A place of purpose. A place where sorrow faded naturally, replaced with new memories that warmed the widow's heart. The Apache became a steady presence by her side, offering his strength in work and his calm in decisions. She found comfort in his quiet company and admired the depth of his loyalty. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold, the children sat near the porch while the Apache repaired a loose hinge. The widow stepped beside him, her gaze sweeping across the valley she once feared to return to. She told him softly that she understood now why the land had called her home. It wasn't to relive the past. It was to build a future. The Apache looked at her with a steady warmth she hadn't seen before. There was no need for grand words. Their shared silence said enough. They had survived danger together. They had rebuilt trust together. They were no longer strangers bound by circumstance. They were partners shaping a new chapter. The children ran to them, laughing, tugging them toward the porch steps. The widow took the smallest child in her arms, and the Apache lifted another onto his shoulder. The valley glowed beneath the fading light, peaceful and alive. Holding their story in its quiet embrace, the ranch was no longer abandoned. It had become a home filled with hope, courage, and second chances. And for the widow, the Apache, and the 5 children who found safety in their care, the land finally felt like a place where love could grow again.